This is chapter 8, page 196. What you need to know is the total fertility rate. So, the total fertility rate is the number of children a woman has on average. So, in a country, if women usually have one or two kids, that total fertility rate could be 1.5. Um, if your mom has three kids, her total fertility as an individual is 3. The replacement fertility is a TFR needed to keep a population stable. So in developed countries like US, Europe, or Japan, that number is 2.1. And that's the number needed to replace the parents. So that 2 is there because you have two parents and they have two kids, and that's how many kids they need to replace them. And then that point 1 accounts for the children who die in childbirth or if they die before their reproductive age. So that's 2.1. In developing countries, like poorer countries, that number needs to be higher because they have higher child mortality, children that won't make it to their reproductive age. And the reason why they won't is because of diseases like bacterial infections or malaria, or in developed countries like in the US, we have vaccines. So, like for polio or for hepatitis, we have those vaccines, but not all countries do. So, their children may have a higher risk of dying. So, parents will need to have more kids so that a couple of them do survive. Over here, this chart shows the total fertility rates for major regions. In Africa, that is 4.7, so their fertility rate is higher, and so they're rapidly growing. In Europe, on the other hand, it is 1.4, and that's lower than the replacement fertility, so their population is shrinking. North America includes Canada and the United States, and that fertility rate is 1.8. That we should be shrinking, but we have a lot of immigration, and so our population is still growing. This this chart is very, very important, the demographic transition model. It is very important. Make sure you know all the stages, pre-industrial, transitional, industrial, and post-industrial, and know what happens in each stage and why. In pre-industrial stage, the birth rate and death rates are high. So the death rates are high because there's no access to medical care, no vaccines, maybe unsanitary conditions, water. So the death rates are high, and the birth rates are high because parents know that a couple of their kids won't survive, so they have to have more kids. So that's pre-industrial. Not many countries, almost no countries, are in pre-industrial stage right now. Maybe a couple of villages deep in the Amazon or very isolated areas or villages, but most countries are in these 3 stages. Transitional stage is kind of the start of the Industrial Revolution, and that's different for every country. Ours was in the 1800s. Some countries are just having their Industrial Revolution now. So right here, their death rates go down. And the death rates decline because they have more food and they have more medical care, more sanitation. And the birth rate is kept the same because parents haven't realized that the kids aren't dying anymore. So they still have like 5 or 6 kids expecting two to survive. So that population increases a lot in this time in the transitional stage because of that. And so in the industrial stage, birth rate starts to go down, and one of the reasons is because people start to realize that, not everybody's dying anymore. And another reason is because women have access to education, birth control. So that goes down, and it catches up with the death rate. Death rate and birth rate are low in post-industrial age, and these are countries that are very developed like Europe, the US, Japan. And actually, there's another stage here that's not included in your book, and you don't have to know it, but the birth rates are actually lower than the death rates. And that's a shrinking population, and that's the case for a lot of the countries now that have gone through this stage. So know all of these. And also know what population momentum is. It takes a generation for 0% growth rate after hitting post-industrial age, because the current generation has to have children. So once we hit this stage, all of these kids still need to have kids. So it's going to take a generation for us to see the death and birth rates on the same page. Something to consider is that, or something to know, is that not all countries are going to go through all stages and get to post-industrial stage. Or a lot of experts think that that won't happen, or that won't be the case, because the population increase is going to put a large strain on resources. There's going to be famine, conflicts, wars because of that. And so not all countries may get to this stage, but yeah, something to definitely know. That's something called demographic fatigue, which is on this page. You don't need to know that term. So ways to reduce population growth. The number one way to reduce population growth, very important, very, very important, is education for women. And that doesn't mean birth control or family planning. That means getting girls into schools and having them stay in school, learning to read, to write, just education in general is very important. And then also lower infant mortality, which seems counterintuitive, but when there's less infants dying, then parents won't have to have more kids, expecting that some will die. So when they know that, okay, not all my kids are going to die, then they can have less kids. They can have 2 kids and they'll know, oh, I'll be fine. And then other is, of course, family planning and birth control. Okay, so equality for women and freedom for women equals lower fertility rates. So why? Why is that? Education for women allows girls to marry later and earn their own money, and both of these things are going to lower the total fertility rate. So when girls go to school, go to college, or they get a career, they get a job, they don't have to rely on anyone else for survival needs. So they can choose to marry later, and then they can choose to have kids later. What happens in a lot of developing or poor countries is that girls get married off at a very young age, early teens, because parents can't afford to feed the girls. And so they'll marry them off, and girls will not have a good education. They will start having kids early on, and the earlier you have kids, the more kids you'll have. And so, and they also won't have birth control. In these poor countries, a lot of times, there isn't birth control, and they don't have freedom to use birth control either. So if girls have education, then it's going to really lower the total fertility rate. They can choose to have kids later. Know the figure and terms here. This goes with what I just talked about. The reproductive window for a woman is about 35-ish years. And so women can, if they wanted to, they could have a lot of kids. But usually they don't. And like I said, in developed countries, they space them out. They don't have as many because they get to focus on education, career, and because of birth control, they can space out their pregnancies. So read this, know this. We're going to go on to page 202. So something that's not in your book, the quality of life, this is not in your book, so it's starred. The quality of life is based on 2 things, life expectancy and infant mortality rate. So life expectancy is how long a person can expect to live, and then infant mortality rate. And then the developing world, some characteristics that you should know is that developing countries have higher infant mortality rates, and they have more children in the workforce. On this page, no biocapacity. It's right here, bolded. And on this page, this is a figure showing the material wealth in the U.S. compared to India. So how much stuff we use, what our ecological footprint is, so it's higher here. And then in India, how many things they have, how much material items they have, and then their ecological footprint. And that is all for chapter 8.